Hello, and welcome to Kloeker's Education Foundation, where we provide quality content for amazing teachers and students. If you're joining us from our previous video on the geography of Russia and Central Asia, welcome back. And if this is your first time, we're glad you're here. This is our World Geography series, and this lesson is on the physical geography of Africa. Before we get into our lesson, don't forget to check out the link in the description below for a set of free guided notes. Let's dive in. Now, the geography of Africa. In previous videos, we've talked about tectonic plates and how tectonic plates are constantly moving, and the plate of Africa has been connected to a lot of the tectonic plates that have moved. Again, coming from Pangaea about 200 million years ago. Now, the continental plate of Africa has maintained a higher altitude than most other tectonic plates. Most of the land is about 1,000 feet above sea level. However, there are huge depressions or basins found in Africa, which are hundreds of miles wide and several thousand feet deep, which are going to alter the terrain of the continent of Africa. Africa is home to many unique geographical features, including the longest river in the world, the Nile River, running through Egypt all the way down through Sudan and Ethiopia. About 4,000 miles long and being a source of life for many people in Africa, including about 95% of Egyptians. Africa is also home to the Rift Valley. As tectonic plates continue to separate, the Madagascar plate continuing to drift eastward, there's a huge rift, a tear, a crack forming within the continent of Africa, which runs through Ethiopia all the way down to Mozambique. Again, when these cracks get very deep, fresh water is filling in, of course, bringing more moisture to the area, but it is tearing the continent into quite literally. Again, this is just a demonstration of how that rift is forming. Again, with the tectonic plates separating, the continental crust is sliding, and that rift valley is being formed at a major depression compared to the rest of the area. Another major geographical feature of Africa is Mount Kilimanjaro. It is the highest mountain within Africa, the fourth largest in the world, several thousands of feet high, and it is going to be a tourist destination because thousands of people will travel to Africa with the intent to climb Mount Kilimanjaro to the summit every year, bringing in lots of economic resources to the area. Because of the tectonic plates shifting and constantly either grinding past each other, there's quite stark altitude adjustments, and these are of course known as escarpments, where we have parts of the plateaus that are super high, and then several hundred feet down, we continue the plateau. Again, this is caused from hundreds and thousands and millions of years of tectonic plates moving and shifts within the Earth's crust. And we see these escarpments running all across the continent of Africa. Now, Africa is very rich within minerals and resources. They have platinum, they have gold, diamonds, oil, cobalt, which is all used to make steel. But the issue with a lot of the resources within Africa is that it was exploited by European powers with imperialism for many hundreds of years, and it's mismanaged by some of the current governments within Africa, and of course, lots of conflict that destabilizes the region, where they're all using these resources for their own gain as opposed for the benefit of the nation state. Now, talking about resources with steel, cobalt, platinum, oil is going to be very important for the continent of Africa. Libya, Nigeria, and Algeria produce about 7% of the world's oil, and there's lots of more oil resources found within Central and South Africa. But because of the civil wars, the lack of stability, there has not been the chance or the opportunity to consistently use those resources to acquire wealth for the nation. Now, another geographical feature which is hard to miss in Africa is the Sahara Desert. Now, Sahara is coming from a ancient Arabic word, of course, meaning desert, and so in literal translation, it is desert, desert. But the Sahara Desert is the largest desert in the world. It's several thousand miles long, 1,000 miles plus north to south. It gets very incredibly hot, 136 degrees in the day, as low as 30 degrees at night. And lots of it is simply rock. Only about 20% of it is sand towards the surface. And while there are oases which make it possible for people to traverse the Sahara Desert to get either from north to south or across, it is very difficult, and so we see limited wildlife with the exception of things like camel, which can go for several days without water. Again, here you just see the vastness of the Sahara Desert running across the entire continent from the Red Sea all the way to the Atlantic and several hundreds of miles from north to south, almost reaching the Mediterranean all the way down to Central Africa. It is a unique cultural unifier for Northern Africa, and we'll talk about that later on in this lesson. Now, with the shortages of water, there are efforts to dig wells within the continent of Africa, of course, to provide water and resources, but again, the lack of stability in many places and the exploitation by European powers have made that difficult. And so we do see that there are aquifers within the continent of Africa, and there is water underneath the ground. It just needs to be extrapolated from the ground to be provided for the people living on top. There are places where these aquifers have reached the surface. These are, of course, known as oases. They are hubs that support the plants and the animals, and of course, travelers that are crossing the Sahara Desert and provide a source of life to this barren region. Now, when we talk about the climate of Africa, there are going to be places within Africa that get very little rain, such as the Sahara Desert. However, as we travel further and further south and get towards the equator, we're going to see a drastic increase where places are getting almost too much rain, and we see vast and lush rainforests developing. So you can see here, right, as you go from the equator and move your way north, you get less and less rain. And as you go further and further south, you get a little bit less rain. However, it is nowhere near the dryness of the Sahara Desert. Now, the tropical grasslands that control and dominate Central Africa are known as the Serengeti. Of course, these grass plains, very iconic in lots of Hollywood movies. You've probably seen the movies Madagascar, which shows some of these Serengeti plains. It's the home to a lot of the wild animals that we know: wildebeest, rhino, zebras, lions, and of course lots more. However, Central Africa on the eastern coast towards Congo is dominated by lush rainforest. Again, this is because of the amount of rain and the moisture being close to the equator. Home to hundreds of exotic plants, right? We see that there are several layers within the rainforest. You have, of course, the rainforest floor, which is fighting for survival when it comes to sunlight and rain, because as trees continue to grow and grow and grow, the understory, the canopy, the emergent layer, they're absorbing all the rain and getting all the sun first, and so less and less of that is reaching the rainforest floor. Because of the later development and the lack of support, when European powers have removed themselves from Europe, we see that, like Latin America, many farmers in Africa are using the slash and burn method, where they are chopping down vast portions of the forest and planting their crops after burning, which is putting nutrients into the ground and fertilizing it. However, it's quickly draining the soil of its nutrients before they have to continue this process of slash and burn to grow their crops. Now, the Niger Delta is a major feature within Central Africa. This is, of course, going into Nigeria and on the borders of Cameroon and Benin. This is a very oil-rich region within Nigeria. It is one of the top oil-producing nations in the world. However, because of the rush to extrapolate this resource from the ground, to pull this resource from the ground. It has been done at the cost of some safety hazards that, of course, have cost thousands of lives and has quite often spilled and caused major damage to the regional environment. Between the rainforest of Central Africa and the Sahara Desert along the north, the region in between the two is known as the Sahel, Arabic for shore. This is a small strip of grasslands which are similar to the Cerrado and the Pampas in Latin America, used for farming and herding. But what's unique about this is it is the process of desertification, where they're combating the expansion of the desert caused by overgrazing, by the slash and burning farming, where the soil is stripped of its nutrients, and they're actively fighting against the expansion of the Sahara Desert. And so slowly it is becoming better with managing the planting of trees and the betterment of land management. And so we see some of this process drawn out with little rainfall. Vegetation is kind of hard to sustain, barely having enough water unless it's pulled out through an aquifer, which there are few and far between. The slash and burn, the overgrazing, again, not managing the land properly, is going to result in the dry grass dying. It is going to have tougher shrubs growing that are more resistant to the lack of water, and they are, of course, going to be fighting with the plants that are currently there, fighting over the few resources. And as the last few animals devour those plants, we enter a point where there is little to no vegetation, the rain is not falling, and the dry soil is turning into a desert-like state. Now, controlling water is a huge issue. With few major rivers running through northern Africa, such as the Nile, the Egyptians have a monopoly on trying to control some of that water as it goes into the Mediterranean. We see that they're building the Answar Dam in the 1970s with the help of the Soviet Union to regulate and irrigate water. They form lakes and other reservoirs using the water from the Nile. However, up the river into Ethiopia, there have been efforts to dam the Nile River so that water does not flow down as much into Egypt. There's also the issue of when they dam and we're changing how the water is naturally flowing, you are flooding ancient temples that have been around for thousands of years, damaging the soil, changing some of the ecosystems, and of course, this is going to be quite controversial for many of the nations within Africa, especially those that border the Nile River. Now, for the rest of this lesson, we're going to break down each individual region within Africa. We're going to break down East Africa and the cultures and heritage found there. We'll break down Central Africa and lastly South Africa and kind of work our way down the continent. Now, East Africa is often called the cradle of humanity. It is where we found some of the first fossils of Homo habilis, the first creatures to use stone tools. And there's still monuments, and we keep finding new and new fossils in East Africa all the time from this era. East Africa has been home to many ancient civilizations, such as Aksum, found in 100 AD. They are going to have known to have traded with the Egyptians and even have gone so far to trade with the Romans in the Mediterranean. However, we see that with the rise of Islam in the 600s, that the trading partners are going to decline as well as the total state of the empire. East Africa has been colonized by many European nations during the 18 and 1900s, where they came in to fight over the resources, specifically in this region, the Germans and the Italians, in places like Somalia and Ethiopia following in the 1930s, taking those natural resources for the homeland in a course of European imperialism or European expansionism. And of course, this is all orchestrated when the European powers met in 1884 and they agreed to divide up the continent of Africa. Shockingly enough, the people who were not invited to the Berlin Conference was anyone from the continent of Africa. And so, with European powers fighting over the resources, the French, the Spanish, the British, the Germans, the Dutch, the Portuguese, and even the Belgians, they're fighting and drawing lines over these resources, so they are not going to war with each other, but rather using alliances to colonize an entire continent. And by 1914, the only two free countries left would be Liberia and Ethiopia. You can see here on this map of the colonial rule in 1914 what European nations occupied. Of course, the Spanish in northern Africa with the French, the British occupying most of the Nile and parts of West Africa, the Germans, the Belgians, the Italians occupying pieces of Central and East Africa, and Liberia and Ethiopia being the last two free nations. Now, in 1970, most of these Eastern European African countries have gained their independence. However, they are not adequately prepared for government by the Europeans who left. Many times it was drawn to put hostile tribes or rival tribes within the same state so that they would be at a constant civil war fighting each other, and there would not be a unified African power. We see this play out in 1993 within the state of Rwanda, where the Hutu tribe begins a mass genocide, a mass murdering of the Tutsi people. We see this portrayed, of course, in Hollywood films, where we have stories like Hotel Rwanda and Sometimes in April of brave men and women who took heroic steps to save their families and their people. Economically speaking, we see that there are major cash crops being grown within East Africa: coffee, sugar, and tea, much like in Latin America, being sold at high profits. We also see tourism, especially in southeastern Africa, in places like Uganda and Tanzania and Kenya, where we have the safari driving a lot of foreign investment. Now, there are hundreds of tribes within Eastern Africa. However, the two major tribes within East Africa are the Maasai, living in the Rift Valley, and the Kikuyu, which are living in Kenya, and they're both major shepherds, ranchers, farmers within the area, bringing up livestock. Now, East Africa is where we did see a large part of the AIDS, HIV epidemic, the pandemic of those diseases break out. Of course, it spread throughout the rest of the continent of Africa and spread around the globe, hitting its peak in the early 90s. Now, there are a lot of facts and myths about HIV and AIDS. HIV, you can get, it is transmitted through sexual intercourse, through the sharing of needles. Mothers can pass it to their children through pregnancy, and of course through blood transfusion. You cannot get it through shaking hands with someone or someone coughing, sneezing, or sweating, and no, you cannot get it through mosquitoes. Now, there is medication to treat this. In the US, it is quite expensive. It's about $228 a month, and these pills are expensive not just in the US, they're almost impossible to get outside of major first world countries. Because of that, this pandemic has spread. There's about 40 million currently battling HIV worldwide, 26 million within the continent of Africa. Thousands are infected daily. Children are, of course, orphaned as their parents pass away through this disease, and we've seen it migrate as an epidemic through East Africa, really settling within South Africa, where there's the highest number of AIDS and HIV at 5.3 million. Now, I ended our first session talking about the imperialism within Africa, specifically those in Eastern Africa, and so I want to circle back to cover the physical geography of North Africa before we continue down into West, Central, and South Africa. One of the first major civilizations to dominate North Africa was the Phoenicians, coming out of the Middle East, settling along the coast of Northern Africa, founding cities like Tripoli and Palermo. They are ultimately known for the major port of Carthage. They are going to be major traders with the rest of Europe, and if you've we've talked, and you may have heard the word of phonetics. That is, of course, coming from the Phoenicians. Ultimately, though, despite the vast sea power that they are, they're going to fall to the Roman Republic and be destroyed in 202 BC, but not after Hannibal marched his army through the Alps, of course, taking elephants and sacking Rome, but ultimately they're going to fall to the Roman Empire. The Phoenicians are, of course, going to be around. The Egyptians are also going to be another major civilization within northern Africa, the Nile being a major source of life for thousands of years for Egyptians. And it's significant because the Nile floods at regular intervals that are very predictable, and so it makes farming rather practical along the Nile. Ancient Egypt has been around for thousands of years. It was unified in 3100 BC, and the culture has been rather consistent for most of Egypt. As a matter of fact, the Egyptian pharaohs are going to pretty much preach and serve themselves as a god for their civilizations. They're going to build pyramids to act as tombs for them in the afterlife. And we see this when historians classify Egypt into three major time periods. You have the Old Kingdom, which is in the 2000 BC, the Middle Kingdom, and of course the New Kingdom, which is going to extend into the Romans. And we see the pyramids set up, over thousands of years. They were building these as tombs for themselves and for future generations, and the goal was always to have the next biggest and better pyramid. It's quite remarkable that all of this was used. How they get the stones up there, you can see the pyramids of Giza on this photo. A lot of people see this in the movies and they think, oh, it's out in the middle of nowhere. It is right on the edge of Cairo. As a matter of fact, you can see it in that photo there. Most of the photos taken of the pyramids of Giza are taken from the city looking out into the countryside as opposed to facing inwards. We see it kind of here. You can see Cairo in the bottom right hand distance, but this massive pyramids built as tombs for the pharaohs, built without cement and so placed mathematically precise that if you were to alter it just an eighth of an inch, the entire structure wouldn't stand, that you'd be completely off with the size of the pyramid. It's also home to the Great Sphinx, right? This has puzzled people. Many historians are going to debate whether it was a cat's head or a dog's head and was later chiseled down into the shape of a human face, although it is true that when Napoleon conquered ancient Egypt, the land of pharaohs, that he took a cannon and blasted the nose off the Sphinx as a point of demoralizing the Egyptians and the Mamelukes, which were ruling Egypt at the time. Now, ancient Egyptian, the hieroglyphics, the writings, we still have records of these. We kind of understand the sounds they make and what they were used to symbolize for, although we don't understand all of the words. Many of them were written on clay tablets, written on walls. Many of them are written on papyrus, which was an early ancient form of paper. And the difference between a hieroglyphic and a lowerglyphic is where you find it on the wall. That was a joke, by the way. So with the emergence of Islam in the 600, Islam is going to spread across northern Africa quite rapidly. The Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Romans, they did not deal with Islam. They were dealing with the ancient Greek religion, the ancient Roman religions, the ancient Egyptian religions. The religion of Islam, introduced by Muhammad in 632, is going to spread rather rapidly. And once it drives out Christianity from that region, it's going to hold on and have held on as the prominent religion since the 600, 800s, when it finally took over as the majority religion. We're going to continue down, focusing on West Africa and then Central and South. So let's get into it. When the European powers are going to be colonizing the New World and killing the natives when they are deciding to replace native labor with enslaved labor from Africa. Many, many millions of slaves are going to be brought from Africa to the New World, specifically through West Africa. The Gory Island, operated by the Portuguese, had an estimated of over 20 million slaves brought to the New World just from this one island port alone, and 1 in 5 will end up dying in the transatlantic slave route. Several major African kingdoms and tribes will have developed within Western Africa, specifically Ghana, Mali, and the Songhai, are as well as the Ashanti. They're, of course, going to have their own unique cultures. We'll see with the trade of Europeans, we'll see advanced weaponry, we'll see advanced tools coming in. There's great soil because we're south of the Sahara. We're starting to get to a point where you have decent rainfall, so farming is rather stable, and we find gold, or they find gold in the 7th century. With Ghana being the first kingdom to rise in 800, of course, it is going to be built on the gold that is found. They're going to also trade, and we can see the trade routes going across Central Africa over to East Africa. We see that it's also going to the Middle East, trading through Cairo, and into Europe through Tunis and Algiers. And again, trading salt, trading gold for the goods of the Europeans. However, we see it starting to decline, and ultimately we see the fall of the Kingdom of Ghana with the expansion of Islam into West Africa through jihad. Now, with the fall of Ghana, we see the rise of Mali. Mali is better, it's bigger, it's larger, it's better organized, still relying on gold as a major point of trade, still relying on salt, and using slave trade to the Arab states in northern Africa. It is going to be quite an economic power, again, growing in its expansion. We see the creation of Timbuktu, which is a major trading point for when the British invade and try to colonize West Africa. But in 1400, the Songhai will replace the Mali Empire, again, even bigger and better than the previous two. This is where we see the stories of Mansa Musa, one of the wealthiest men ever, where he would literally travel and just hand out gold and bankrupt entire city-states by charity. It's also going to be a hub for intellectual learnings for those in Central and South Africa, but ultimately it's going to fall in the 1590s to non-Muslim African tribes as they try to reconquer their lands. And West Africa has pretty unique culture. We see Benin art, we see statues made out of metal and terracotta, we see lots made out of bronze. We see the Ashanti living in Ghana who weave very colorful clothing known as the kente. And again, these patterns, we see it even in 2025. We see it in lots of African American heritage. We see these colors, these patterns still around to this day. We're going to get through Central Africa and then through South Africa to end off the lesson. Central Africa is kind of unique because it has a lot of the shared stories and continuity of the surrounding regions, East Africa, West Africa, North and South Africa. We saw that in the 2000 BC migration of the Bantu people. We're going to see their language spread quickly throughout Central Africa. We have hundreds of millions of Africans who still speak the Bantu language. We will see that Central Africa is going to be a hub for the transatlantic slave trade, the Middle Passage, as well as West Africa, again, bringing over a vast amount of slaves to South America and to North America, brought over by the Europeans after they've murdered and killed off most of the labor from the Native Americans. And we see that most of the African tribes are going to take part in the slave trade, selling prisoners of war, selling criminals to the Europeans. Misconceptions, the Europeans were not going and actively arresting people. They were trading with the established African kingdoms within Central and Western Africa, who would in turn take the weapons from the Europeans and go expand their power and enslave the neighboring hostile tribes and then sell them to the Europeans. And we see that it ends in 1870 when Brazil finally ends slavery a few years after the end of the Civil War. Now, the shared story of North Africa and the involvement of the slave trade with West Africa, they do have quite a similar shared story with East Africa, with the European imperialism and colonization. With the Berlin Conference, the nation state of Belgium was chosen to get the land of Congo, and so King Leopold, again, using imperialism and colonization to establish cities, but also withdraw as much resources as he can from the Congo to fuel the Belgian nation state. It's estimated that 8 to 10 million people were killed by the Belgians. It was quite a merciless genocide and slaughter of people who resisted against the Belgians. Very similar story with the Germans who were involved in Central Africa as well. And we still see some of the scars of that even today in the 2020s. Those scars are still being recovered from the exploitation of the Europeans when they were bringing slaves to the New World. Again, lots of the resources were withdrawn or extrapolated, taken out of Africa, and used for the involvement of Europe and the European colonies, used in the New World in North and South America. And again, they did not establish great governing systems when the Europeans chose to leave. They just kind of up and left without establishing great patterns for management. We do see that there are strides to improve education within Central Africa. Lots of emphasis on education. However, there's a mass shortage of teachers. There's a mass shortage of schools. And the schools that are there, of course, are of danger from warlords, from terrorists taking over and killing or enslaving the students, and trying to control the message and the ideas that are being taught in education in Central Africa. Lastly, we're going to end our lesson on the physical geography and cultures of South Africa, not just the nation state of South Africa, but the region of South Africa. Now, South Africa, the region, is home to a lot of ancient empires, one of which, with the Bantu people migrating down, the tribe known as the Great Zimbabwe builds their capital, calling it the Great Zimbabwe, a huge trading hub for the region of South Africa, a huge military fortress, which unfortunately was destroyed by the British when they colonized the region. And by the name of Matola is going to leave the Great Zimbabwe and migrate north and is going to establish the Mutapa Empire, again established on the trading of gold and resources with Central African tribes, those in South Africa, and eventually the Europeans. And while this goes on for several hundreds of years, ultimately we're going to see the arrival of the Dutch in South Africa first, the Dutch Boers, who are going to try to colonize the region of South Africa. Shortly after the Dutch arrival, we'll see the arrival of the British. They're going to fight for control of South Africa, and this is known as the Boer War. Eventually, the British will seize control of the region, defeating the Dutch and establishing British government-like policies and colonies throughout South Africa. The nation of South Africa will eventually be created, and in 1948, shortly after the end of World War II, they're going to pass a policy known as apartheid, which is segregation, the segregation of races within South Africa. It segregates schools and public facilities between white South Africans and black South Africans, even though the white population in South Africa was a minority at only around 25%. This policy was quite controversial. The black Africans have been fighting for their rights in South Africa since 1912, for a very long time, fighting for their independence against the British and the Dutch with the Zulu tribe. Eventually, we'll see the rise of Nelson Mandela in South Africa, leading the ANC. He'll be the first black president elected in 1994 in South Africa, which is a huge achievement. And he will be the president that ends apartheid. Now, unfortunately, apartheid left many Africans with little to no education, limited job skills because they were not allowed in schools. The white Africans dominated the economy with better paying jobs and better paying education. We see that there is still instability in the region because there was not proper controls set up for management. We see that the diamond industry is a large industry within South Africa, the region, but it is poorly managed because of the lack of stability. And that wraps up our lesson. Thanks for joining us. Our next unit on the geography of Southwest Asia or the Middle East is just a click away. I'll see you there.